The church bell rang shortly after dawn. It was not the slow rhythm used for Sunday service, or the sharp, repeated alarm that meant fire. 3 strikes a pause, then 3 more. A village meeting. Across Millstone Valley, farmers stopped what they were doing and looked toward the stone tower in the center of the village. Mara Vale heard the bell while standing in her eastern wheat field. The crop was close to harvest. The heads had turned gold, but the lower stems still held streaks of green. She broke a kernel between her teeth. It was firm, though, not fully hard. Another 2 or 3 dry days would have brought most of the field to the stage she wanted. Her 17-year-old daughter Lena came running from the farmhouse with a phone in her hand. They changed the forecast. Mara looked toward the western hills. The sky was clear, except for a thin gray line above the ridge. How much storms tomorrow night? Maybe earlier. Maybe. The warning says the system is moving faster. Lena turned the screen toward her. A weather map showed a broad band of red and yellow approaching from the west. The alert warned of heavy rain, strong winds, and possible hail within 36 hours. Mara read the message twice. Then the church bell rang again. "They want everyone at the square," Lena said. Mara placed the wheat kernel in her pocket. Before leaving, she looked over the field one more time. Swallows normally crossed the wheat every morning, chasing insects above the warm crop. There were fewer of them now. Most were flying toward the eastern slope instead of spreading across the valley. Mara noticed the change, but said nothing. The village square was already crowded when they arrived. Farmers stood in work clothes beside tractors and pickup trucks. Several had come directly from their fields, carrying gloves, tools, and dust on their boots. Tomas Reed stood on the stone steps of the meeting hall. He owned the largest farm in the valley and the only 2 combined harvesters capable of working through the night. When weather threatened, people listened to him because he had the machines, labor, and storage to act quickly. He raised one hand. "The county office has moved the storm forward," he said. "We may have 36 hours, perhaps less." A low murmur moved through the crowd. "How much rain?" someone asked. 2 to 3 inches. Higher amounts where the system slows. What about the wind, strong enough to flatten mature wheat? That answer silenced them. Standing grain could bend under heavy rain and wind. Once lodged against the ground, it became harder to cut, and more vulnerable to mud sprouting and loss. Tomas unfolded a map of the village fields. "We begin today," he said. "My machines will start on the western farms, then move east. Smaller crews will cut the fields near the river. We make windrows where necessary, bring in whatever is dry enough, and cover the rest before the storm." The plan sounded decisive. That was what frightened people wanted. Mara studied the map. "How long will the grain need to dry after cutting?" she asked. Several heads turned. Tomas looked at her. "That depends on the field. The lower fields are still holding moisture. We know, and the grain is not equally mature. We know that too. Then how much can the village safely store before the storm?" Tomas folded his arms. "As much as we can harvest." "That is not the same thing." The square became quiet. Tomas stepped down from the stone platform. "We do not have time for perfect conditions, Mara. I am not asking for perfect conditions. What are you asking for?" "A complete plan." He pointed toward the western hills. "There is the plan. The storm is coming. We cut before it reaches us." Mara looked at the farmers around them. Most had already accepted his conclusion. They were not thinking about ideal moisture or storage capacity. They were imagining fields flattened overnight and a year's income lost before morning. Tomas continued. "Standing wheat is exposed to wind and hail. Cut grain can be gathered, covered, or moved. If it is dry enough, we will dry it afterward." With what? No one answered immediately. The village had one mechanical grain dryer at the cooperative. It could handle a limited amount each day. During a normal harvest, farmers staggered their deliveries. If the entire valley cut at once, the dryer would become a bottleneck. Mara pointed toward the grain warehouse. "If every farm brings wet grain at the same time, where will it go?" "We use temporary storage. Wet grain in temporary piles can heat. We monitor it." "With how many probes, how many fans?" Tomas's expression tightened. "We are facing a storm, not writing a storage manual." A few farmers laughed, but the sound carried more nervousness than humor. Mara did not react. "The storm is 36 hours away," she said. "Dry grain may be farther away than that." Tomas looked toward Lena, then back at Mara. "So what do you suggest? Leave everything standing and hope?" "No." "Then what?" "Test each field. Cut the driest high ground first. Leave the green lower sections until we know what the air is doing. That will take too long. It may take less time than drying an entire village's wet grain. Tomas turned to the crowd. Anyone who wants to wait may wait, but my machines begin within the hour. The meeting ended there. Farmers moved quickly toward their vehicles. Engines started around the square. Men called relatives and hired workers. Within minutes, the village had transformed from a gathering into a coordinated harvest operation. Lena remained beside her mother. Are we joining them? Mara looked toward the sky. The thin gray band above the western hills had widened slightly. We are going back to the field. To start cutting, to check the grain. Lena lowered her voice. Everyone will think you are wasting time, perhaps. And if Tomas is right, then waiting will cost us. Lena searched her mother's face. And if you are right, Mara looked toward the farmers racing out of the square. Then cutting will not save them as quickly as they think. They returned to the farm on foot. The sound of machinery spread across the valley before they reached the eastern field. Tomas's first combine was already moving through wheat near the western road. Mara stepped between the rows and collected grain heads from 3 places: the windy ridge, the middle slope, and the low ground near the willow trees. She opened the first head in her palm. The kernels from the ridge were firm. The kernels from the middle field yielded slightly beneath her thumbnail. The kernels from the low ground were softer and cooler. Lena examined them. They look almost the same. Almost is what causes trouble when everything is mixed together. A flock of swallows passed overhead. They did not descend toward the wheat. They continued east in a tight line toward the narrow gap between the hills. Mara followed them with her eyes. Where are they going? Lena asked. That is what I want to know. You are going to follow birds while the village is harvesting. I am going to find out why they have stopped feeding here. Lena looked toward the western fields where another machine had entered the wheat. You think they know about the storm? No. Mara placed the grain samples into separate cloth bags. I think they know the air has changed. Across Millstone Valley, blades were already lowering into the crop. By noon, the village would have hundreds of acres on the ground. Mara Vale had not cut a single row. While everyone else watched the storm approaching from the west, she turned toward the birds disappearing into the east. By mid-morning, the valley had changed color. Fields that had stood gold at sunrise were being stripped into pale, flattened rows. Combines moved across the western farms while smaller machines worked the narrow plots near the river. Dust rose behind them and hung above the roads. The village had committed to the plan. Once the first machines entered, the wheat hesitation became harder. Every uncut field looked like wasted time. Every farmer who waited risked being blamed if the storm destroyed what remained. Mara stood at the edge of her ridge field and listened to the engines. Lena was beside her, holding the 3 grain samples they had collected. Which section is driest? Lena asked. The ridge, dry enough to harvest, possibly, and the lower field, no. Lena looked toward Thomas Reed's combine, which was moving through a neighboring farm. What if we harvest only the ridge? We may. Then why are we still standing here? Because I want to know what happens to a cut sample before we commit the machine. Mara took a sickle from the tool shed and cut a narrow strip near the top of the field. She tied several bundles loosely and placed them in 3 positions, one in full sun, one near the hedge, and one lower on the slope. She marked each location with a wooden stake. Lena watched in silence. The test looked small compared with the machinery working across the valley. Tomas could clear an entire field before Mara finished weighing her samples. But Mara was not measuring speed. She was measuring whether cutting actually moved the crop closer to safety. A pickup truck approached along the eastern lane. Tomas stopped beside the fence and stepped out. You have a machine available, he said. Mara nodded. My eastern crew can be here in 40 minutes. I did not ask for them. You may not get another chance. Mara looked toward the western sky. Clouds were beginning to form above the ridge, but the storm was still distant. The grain in the low field is too wet. Then leave that section. Cut the rest. I am testing the ridge. Tomas glanced at the narrow strip. That will tell you what you already know. The weather is closing. It will tell me whether the cut grain is drying. We do not need it fully dry in the field. We bring it in and finish the work under cover. With which dryer? The cooperative dryer. It cannot handle the whole village. We rotate loads. And where does the wet grain wait? In trailers, sheds, temporary bins. Mara shook her head. Without enough airflow, wet grain can heat before it reaches the dryer. Tomas exhaled slowly. The argument was no longer private. 2 farmers working near the road had stopped to listen. No one is asking you to store it carelessly, he said. You are asking everyone to harvest at the same time. That creates the storage problem. We solve it after we get the crop out. Mara looked across the valley. Already loaded trailers were moving toward the cooperative. Others waited beside fields where the grain was not dry enough to store safely. The village was treating cutting as the end of the danger. For Mara, it was only the beginning of another stage. Tomas stepped closer to the fence. If your wheat remains standing, and the wind pushes it into the neighboring field, it will slow their machines. I will leave a boundary strip. That is not the only issue. What is the other issue? You are making people doubt the plan. Mara studied him. A plan should survive questions. This one has to survive a storm and wet grain. Tomas lowered his voice. People are frightened. They need one clear direction. Clear is not the same as complete. His expression hardened. We have less than a day and a half. I cannot organize this village around every patch of damp soil. No, but every farmer should know which patch he is cutting. Tomas looked toward Lena. Your mother is willing to risk the crop to prove a point. Mara answered before Lena could react. I am trying to avoid risking all of it at once. For several seconds, only the sound of machinery filled the space between them. Then Tomas pointed toward the standing field. My offer remains open until noon. After that, the machine goes elsewhere. He returned to his truck. Lena watched him drive away. He thinks you are challenging him. I am challenging the assumption. That is not how he sees it. No. Mara returned to the test strip. The bundles in full sun had begun to warm. The grain near the hedge remained cool. Lower on the slope, moisture still clung to the stems close to the ground. She opened one head from each location. The difference was small but clear. The ridge sample was firmest. The shaded sample was softer. The lower sample compressed beneath her thumbnail. Why does that matter if we separate the fields? Lena asked. It matters because the village is not separating enough. Mara pointed toward a neighboring farm. A combine was cutting from the ridge down into a low basin without slowing. All of the grain was entering the same tank. The dry and wet sections are being mixed. Then the average might still be acceptable. For immediate delivery, perhaps. Not necessarily for storage. Mixed grain could hide the wetter portions. A load might appear acceptable overall, while pockets of moisture remained high enough to heat or spoil. Mara tied labels to the 3 sample bags. Ridge, hedge, lower slope. She wanted Lena to see the field not as one crop but as several conditions occupying the same boundary. Near noon, the first wagons began lining up at the cooperative. Eli Grant, the grain store manager, stood on the platform with a moisture meter. He tested each arriving load before allowing it into the main bins. Mara and Lena walked over to watch. The first trailer passed. The second was sent to temporary storage. The third tested high enough that Eli ordered it kept separate. Tomas arrived moments later. How bad, he asked. Not bad yet, Eli said. But the lower fields are coming in wet. How much can the dryer handle today? Less than what is arriving. Tomas looked toward the growing line of trailers. Run it through the night. I plan to. And the rest, I need more fans, more floor space, and more people checking temperatures. We will find them. Eli lowered his voice. If the storm delays transport, some of these loads may sit longer than they should. Tomas looked at Mara. She did not say anything. He already understood the warning. Cutting had removed the grain from the stalk. It had not removed its moisture. A farmer behind them called for Eli to test another load. He pushed the probe deep into the grain, waited, then frowned. Too high for the main bin. The driver swore. I was told to cut. You can cut it, Eli replied. That does not mean I can store it safely. The line continued growing. Lena leaned toward her mother. So this is what you meant. Yes. They may save the wheat from the wind and still lose it here, if they cannot dry it quickly enough. Mara looked toward the sky. The cloud band in the west had thickened, but the eastern slope remained bright. Above the village fields, the swallows were still scarce. Most were moving through the same narrow corridor toward the hills. Mara checked the time. The birds normally fed over the valley until late afternoon. Today they were leaving before the harvest crews stopped for lunch. She turned toward Lena. We need to go east. Now, yes. What about Tomas's deadline? Mara looked back at the line of wet grain waiting outside the cooperative. The machine can wait. Across the valley, the village continued cutting as if every fallen row represented safety. Mara had begun to see the opposite. The more grain they placed on the ground, and in overloaded storage, the more of the harvest depended on dry air that had not yet arrived. Mara and Lena left the cooperative by the eastern road. Behind them, engines continued running across the valley. Combines moved through the wheat while trailers waited in a growing line outside the grain store. Ahead the road narrowed between two hills. The swallows had taken the same route. They flew in small groups now, following the rising ground, instead of circling above the harvested fields. Their movement was purposeful. They stayed low near the hedges, then climbed as they approached the gap between the hills. Lena looked up. They are still feeding. Yes. Then maybe nothing is wrong. The insects just moved. That is exactly what we need to understand. Mara did not believe the birds knew a storm was coming in the way people understood a forecast. They did not measure distance or read weather maps. They responded to what was already happening around them. Wind, pressure, temperature, the movement of insects, the availability of shelter. If the swallows had changed their feeding route, something in the valley had changed first. They crossed the first hill and entered a narrow passage bordered by hawthorn and stone walls. The difference in the air was immediate. A steady breeze moved through the gap. It was not strong, but it was consistent. Grass leaned in one direction. Leaves turned and held their position instead of lifting once and falling still. Lena removed a strand of hair from her face. There is more wind here, Mara nodded, and less heat trapped near the ground. She took a small weather meter from her bag and held it above the grass. The breeze was stronger than it had been in the western fields. Humidity was lower too. They continued uphill. Swallows crossed above them, opening their beaks as they passed through clusters of insects suspended in the moving air. The insects were not spread evenly. They gathered along the sheltered side of the hedge where the wind carried them through the gap. Lena watched the birds turn sharply. They are following the insects. Yes. So the birds did not choose this place because they sensed the storm. They chose it because they can still feed here. Mara pointed back toward the valley. In the lower fields, the air became still. Insects stopped moving through the crop the way they usually do. The birds followed the food into the moving air. Lena frowned. How does that help us decide when to harvest? It tells us the valley is already separating into different conditions. The western fields had become warm, damp, and sheltered. The eastern gap remained ventilated. A farmer looking only at the clear sky might assume the whole village still had good drying weather. The birds had revealed that it did not. Mara walked to a patch of uncut wheat near the top of the hill. It belonged to an elderly farmer who had not yet received a combine. She touched the grain heads. They were warm, the stems moved freely in the breeze, and the soil beneath them felt firm. She opened a kernel. It was harder than the samples from her lower field. "Try this," she said. Lena pressed the kernel between her teeth. "It is much drier. Same village, same forecast, different field." Mara then led her down the opposite side of the hill. Within a few hundred yards, the wind weakened again. The land curved inward, forming a protected basin. Wheat there stood taller and greener. The swallows did not descend. They remained above the ridge and continued east. Mara tested another head. The kernel yielded beneath her thumbnail. "This is closer to our lower field," Lena said. "Yes. So the birds are showing us where the air is moving. They are showing us where their food remains available. We have to understand what that means for the crop." Mara wrote several notes. Eastern gap, steady airflow. Ridge wheat warmer and firmer. Sheltered basin, softer grain, weak ground wind. She added the time. Lena looked toward the swallows, disappearing beyond the hill. "Are we going to keep following them?" "Only until we understand the pattern." They continued to the old quarry, east of the village. A high wall of exposed stone protected the area from the western wind. Swallows had nested in cracks along the upper face for years. Normally they did not return in large numbers until evening. Now dozens were already gathering there. Some continued feeding in the open air. Others settled along the ledges. Lena checked the time. It is not even 1 o'clock. Mara looked toward the western sky. The cloud band had grown thicker. The leading edge remained pale, but darker layers were building behind it. The birds had not all stopped feeding, but many had moved closer to shelter. Mara took out the pressure gauge she carried in her field bag. The reading was lower than it had been that morning. She wrote it down. "Is that enough to prove the storm is coming early?" Lena asked. "No. Then what does it prove? That conditions are changing." Mara counted the observations aloud. "The pressure is falling. Ground wind has weakened in the lower valley. Humidity is rising there. Insects have concentrated in the eastern airflow. The swallows have changed their route and moved closer to shelter. Any one of those could mean nothing. Yes. But together they tell us not to assume the next 30 hours will behave like the forecast screen." Lena looked back toward the village. "So what do? We test our cut strip again. And if it is drying, we may harvest the ridge. And if it is not, we wait. Lena hesitated. What if the birds return to the valley this afternoon? Then we record that too. Mara closed the notebook. Observation is not choosing only the signs that agree with us. They began walking home. From the ridge they could see nearly all of Millstone Valley. The western fields were now pale with cut straw. Machines moved through the middle farms. Near the cooperative, the line of grain trailers had doubled. The eastern farms remained partly standing. Mara's field was still untouched except for the narrow test strip. Tomas's combine had moved closer. Lena stopped. He is almost at our boundary. He said the offer ended at noon. Maybe he changed his mind. Below them, the machine turned and entered another farmer's field. The sight placed a weight in Mara's chest. She knew what waiting could cost. If the storm struck the standing wheat with full force, the stems could lodge. Heads could fall into wet soil. Harvesting afterward would be slower and less complete. The birds did not remove that danger. They only showed that the village's early harvest carried its own danger. Mara continued down the hill. When they reached the farm, she went directly to the test bundles. The bundle left in full sun had warmed, but the kernels were still softer than she wanted. The bundle near the hedge remained cool. The bundle lower on the slope had absorbed moisture from the ground-facing side. Lena lifted it. It feels wetter than before. The air is not carrying moisture away fast enough. Mara spread the bundle open. The top layer looked dry. The stems underneath were damp. If they cut the whole field, much of the crop would lie in the same condition, dry in appearance, vulnerable underneath. A flock of swallows crossed above them. They did not stop. They continued east. Lena watched until they disappeared. What are they telling us now? Mara looked at the cut bundle in her hands. Nothing by themselves. She pointed to the damp stems, but they led us to the question we needed to ask. She looked toward the western fields where the village continued harvesting. Is the air still helping the crop dry? The answer from her test strip was clear. Not enough. Mara carried the bundles into the barn and separated them by location. Then she wrote one final line beneath the day's observations. The birds did not predict the storm. They revealed where the valley had already stopped behaving like one place. By late afternoon, the swallows had stopped crossing the center of the valley almost entirely. Mara stood beside the barn with her notebook open while Lena watched the sky. The change was now obvious. On an ordinary harvest day, the birds would sweep low over the wheat, turning sharply above the warm fields where insects gathered. Today, the space above the lower ground was nearly empty. Most of the movement remained near the eastern ridge. Mara did not need to follow them again. She had already seen the pattern. The question now was whether the same pattern appeared in the crop. She carried the 3 test bundles to the workbench and weighed them again. The bundle from the sunny ridge had lost moisture. The bundle near the hedge had changed very little. The bundle from the lower slope was heavier than expected because the underside had absorbed moisture from the ground and humid air. Lena looked at the numbers. So the ridge is drying. Yes. But the rest is not. Not fast enough. Mara placed the samples beside the grain heads collected that morning. The differences were no longer small. The ridge kernels had hardened further during the day. The lower field kernels remained soft and several still held moisture deep inside. If Mara harvested everything now, the crop would enter the machine as one mixed load. The driest grain would not correct the wettest grain. It would only make the average reading look safer than some parts truly were. That was dangerous because storage problems did not always begin evenly. A pocket of wetter grain could heat inside an otherwise acceptable load. Lena touched one of the lower field kernels. Could we keep each section separate? We could. Then why not cut the ridge tonight? Mara looked toward the western hills. The sun was still high enough to provide several hours of light. The ridge had wind. Its grain was close to ready. It was the first part of the farm that had earned a cautious yes. We may, she said. Lena stared at her. After all this waiting was never the goal. Then what was? To avoid making one decision for 3 different fields, Mara unfolded the hand-drawn map of the farm. She drew a line around the upper ridge. This section has airflow, firmer grain, and dry ground. Then she circled the middle slope. This one is uncertain. Finally, she marked the lower field near the willow trees. This stays standing. Lena studied the map. Tomas will say we are too late. Tomas is solving a village problem, and we are solving ours. We are solving the problem this land actually has. A tractor engine approached. This time it was Eli Grant from the cooperative, not Tomas. He stopped beside the barn and climbed down slowly. His shirt was covered in grain dust. How full are the temporary bins? Mara asked. Too full. And the dryer, running continuously. How many loads are waiting? 11. Lena looked toward the village. Can you dry all of them before the storm? Eli shook his head. Not if more arrive at the same rate. Mara handed him the 3 samples. He checked the ridge grain first. This is close. Then the middle slope, higher. Finally the lower field. He pressed a kernel between his fingers. This should not go into storage without drying. That is why it remains standing, Mara said. Eli looked across the field. Tomas believes you are wasting the final clear hours. What do you believe? I believe the cooperative cannot handle another full wet harvest. He handed the samples back. If you cut the ridge, keep it separate. Bring it to me before midnight, and I will test it. What about the middle field? Wait until you know more. Lena looked surprised. You agree with her, I agree with the samples. Eli returned to his tractor. Before leaving, he looked toward the eastern ridge. I noticed the swallows, too. Mara waited. My father used to say they flew differently before heavy weather. That does not tell us when the storm will arrive. No, Eli said. But today they left the same low fields that are sending me the wettest grain. He drove back toward the cooperative. Lena watched him disappear down the road. So now the birds matter. They matter as part of the pattern. Mara pointed toward the test bundles. The grain confirms the real problem. The 2 of them prepared the smaller combine. Mara checked the fuel, tightened a loose belt, and cleaned the moisture sensor. She did not want speed to introduce another mistake. At 5 o'clock, the machine entered the ridge field. The first rows fell cleanly. The grain tank filled slowly, and Mara stopped after a short distance to test the first load. The moisture reading was higher than ideal, but within the range Eli could manage. She continued. The machine moved only along the marked ridge. When the land began sloping downward, Mara stopped and turned. From the road, the harvest looked incomplete. A neat golden section became pale stubble, while the rest of the field remained standing. Tomas arrived before sunset. He parked near the boundary and looked at the sharp line between cut and uncut wheat. So you finally started. The ridge was ready. The whole field should be down before morning. The whole field is not ready. He pointed toward the darkening clouds. The storm will not care which section was ready. No, but the grain store will. Tomas glanced toward the trailer filling beside the combine. How much? Only the ridge. You are giving up half a day of machine time. I am keeping the wettest grain out of the cooperative. We can dry it. Eli says you are already beyond capacity. Tomas's expression changed. He should have told me. He is trying to manage what is arriving. Tomas looked back toward the village, where tractors continued moving through the last standing fields. We cannot stop now. Mara understood. Too many farmers had already committed. Machines had been assigned. Trailers were full. The village plan depended on continuing forward. Stopping would mean admitting that cutting faster had created a second emergency. Tomas lowered his voice. If everyone worked as you are working, much of the valley would still be standing when the storm arrives. Perhaps. And if the wind flattens it, then we harvest slowly afterward. And if the heads sprout, we lose quality. You say that as if it is acceptable. It is not acceptable. Mara looked toward the trailers waiting near the cooperative, but neither is wet grain heating and storage. Tomas had no answer. He returned to his truck and left without another word. By dusk, Mara and Lena had finished the ridge. They had harvested less than a third of the farm. The grain was loaded separately and marked with the field name. Eli tested it at the cooperative and accepted it into a ventilated holding bin. The rest of Mara's wheat remained rooted in the ground. As they walked home, the eastern air was still moving. The lower valley had become almost completely still. Above the ridge, the final swallows disappeared toward the quarry. Lena looked back at the uncut field. Do you think they were warning us? Mara shook her head. They were responding before we understood what they were responding to. She closed the notebook. The birds led us to moving air. The grain told us what that difference meant. Behind them, the village continued harvesting under floodlights. Ahead of the storm, 2 risks were now taking shape. One remained standing in Mara's field. The other was already piling up inside the village. Before sunrise, Eli sent word from the cooperative. The temporary bins were nearly full. 3 trailers had been left outside because the grain dryer could not process them fast enough. Workers had spread tarps beneath the loads and positioned portable fans around them, but the humid night air had slowed everything. Mara read the message twice. Lena stood beside her at the kitchen table. Does that mean they will stop harvesting? No. Even with nowhere to put the grain, they will try to create more space. Outside engines were already starting. The village had less than a day before the storm was expected to arrive. Tomas had ordered crews to continue through the morning, concentrating on the remaining lower fields. Those were the wettest fields in the valley. Mara carried her moisture meter outside and walked toward the middle slope. The wheat stood motionless beneath a gray sky. There was no rain yet, but sunlight had disappeared behind a thin layer of cloud. She selected heads from several rows, placing each sample in a separate bag. Lena followed with the notebook. Why test again? We already know the lower field is wet. We know what it was yesterday. And today the air is different. They began with the upper edge of the middle slope. The kernels were firmer than they had been the previous afternoon, but the reading remained above Mara's preferred storage level. Farther down the slope, the grain was wetter. Near the willow trees, the kernels were still soft enough to mark with a thumbnail. Mara wrote the results beside the previous day's numbers. The field had made almost no progress overnight. Lena studied the page, so even if we cut now, it still has to be dried mechanically. Yes. And the dryer is already full. Yes. Then why is Tomas cutting the lower farms? Because the storm is becoming more visible than the storage problem. The clouds could be seen. The wet grain inside trailers could not. One danger appeared dramatic and immediate. The other developed quietly after the crop had been removed from the field. That made it easier to ignore. They walked to the cooperative. The yard was crowded with tractors, wagons, and men, shouting instructions over the machinery. Grain dust floated beneath the loading roof. Eli stood beside an open trailer with a long temperature probe in his hand. He pushed it deep into the grain and waited. When he removed it, his expression tightened. Warm, Mara asked. Warmer than it should be. How long has it been sitting? Since yesterday afternoon. The grain had not spoiled, but its temperature was rising. Moisture trapped inside the load allowed biological activity to continue. Without enough airflow, heat could accumulate. Eli ordered the trailer unloaded onto the concrete floor in a thinner layer. 2 workers began shoveling immediately. Tomas approached from the main bin. We are clearing the western shed, he said. That gives us room for 6 more loads. Not 6 wet loads, Eli replied. We will run fans. You do not have enough fan capacity. We have no choice. We always have a choice. You simply dislike the other one. Tomas glanced at Mara. The other choice is leaving wheat under a storm. Mara pointed toward the open trailer. And this choice is bringing the storm problem indoors. Tomas ignored the comment. How much of your crop is still standing? More than half. Then you should understand what we are trying to prevent. I understand it. Do you? He gestured toward the sky. If the wind reaches the speed they are predicting, your middle field could be flat by morning. It could. And you are willing to accept that I am willing to accept the risk. I still have room to manage. Tomas looked toward the cooperative buildings. And you think we cannot manage this, Eli answered. Not at the rate you are sending it. Another trailer pulled into the yard. The driver climbed down and handed Eli a sample. Eli tested it. Too wet for the main bin. Tomas pointed toward the cleared western shed. Put it there. Eli did not move. That shed has no floor ventilation. We will turn the grain manually. With what labor, everyone is in the fields. Tomas lowered his voice. If we stop harvesting now, people will blame us for everything the storm destroys. And if we store grain badly, Eli asked, they will blame you for that too. The words silenced him. Mara understood the pressure Tomas faced. He was no longer making a farming decision. He was protecting the decision he had already made. If he stopped, the uncut fields would remain exposed, and the village would see it as failure. If he continued, the storage problem would grow, but its consequences might not become visible until later. Tomas turned to Mara. You harvested the ridge. Why not cut the middle slope and keep it separate? Because separate storage is no longer available. I can make room. You can make floor space. That is not the same as creating drying capacity. He stepped closer. You would rather watch the crop fall. I would rather leave it where air can still move through it than pile it wet where heat cannot escape. Tomas stared at her, then walked away. Lena watched him cross the yard. He knows you are right about the storage. He knows there is a problem. Then why not change the plan? Because changing a plan in public feels like admitting the first decision was wrong. They returned to the farm before noon. The sky had darkened further, though the storm line remained beyond the western ridge. Mara checked the test bundles. The ridge bundle had dried enough to handle. The middle slope bundle remained damp beneath the outer layer. The lower bundle had changed almost not at all. She opened several heads and placed the kernels beside one another on the workbench. To Lena, the difference in color was slight, but when she pressed them, the contrast was clear. The ridge grain resisted. The middle grain yielded. The lower grain remained soft. If all of these were mixed, Mara said a single average reading might hide the wettest portion, and the wet part could heat first. Yes. Lena looked toward the standing field. So we wait. We wait on the middle and lower ground. What about the narrow strip beside the eastern hedge? Mara looked at the map. That strip had caught more wind than the rest of the slope. Its grain might be ready enough to harvest separately. They walked out to test it. The kernels were firmer. The soil off the plants was dry. Mara marked the boundary with stakes. We take only this section. Lena nodded without arguing. By early afternoon, the combine entered the field. It cut a narrow band along the eastern hedge, then stopped before the land dipped downward. Farmers passing on the road slowed to watch. To them, Mara's harvest looked fragmented and inefficient. But every boundary had a reason. One section could be stored safely, the next could not. As the small load left for the cooperative, the first distant thunder rolled across the valley. Mara looked west. The storm was closer now. But the wheat in her lower field was still standing, still separated from the wet grain, accumulating inside the village sheds. The crop was not safe. Neither was the village's. The difference was that Mara had not mistaken cutting for rescue. By mid-afternoon, thunder was no longer distant. It rolled across Millstone Valley in slow, uneven waves, each one louder than the last. The storm had not yet crossed the western ridge, but its shadow had already changed the color of the fields. The village kept harvesting. Machines moved faster now. Farmers no longer stopped to inspect every load. Grain was cut, transferred, and sent toward whatever storage space remained. Mara stood at the edge of her lower field with Lena. The wheat moved only at the top. Near the ground, the air remained still. Lena looked toward the darkening sky. If we leave it standing, the wind could flatten everything. Yes. And if we cut it, the grain will be too wet. Yes. Then both choices are bad. Mara nodded. That is the real decision. Lena had expected her mother to defend waiting as the safe choice. Instead, Mara knelt and pulled several stems together. There is no safe option now, she said. Only different kinds of damage. She broke a head open and placed several kernels in Lena's hand. The grain from the lower field was fuller than it had been 2 days earlier, but it was still soft. Its moisture had not fallen enough for direct storage. Mara pointed toward the cooperative. If we cut, now this grain joins everything already, waiting for fans and dryer space. And if we do not, the storm may lodge it. Lena looked over the field. What happens if wheat lodges? The stems bend or break. The heads fall close to the soil. The combine has to cut lower and move more slowly. Some grain is missed. Some may begin sprouting if the rain continues. So waiting could reduce the harvest. Yes. Then why is it still better? Mara stood. It is not automatically better. It is the loss we may still be able to manage. She drew 2 columns in the notebook. At the top of the first, she wrote, "Cut now." Below it, "Grain enters storage too wet, dryer already overloaded, temporary sheds lack airflow. Cut material is exposed near the ground. A storm before transport could soak it further." At the top of the second column, she wrote, "Leave standing." Below it, "Wind may flatten the crop. Heads may touch wet soil. Harvest becomes slower. Some quality and yield may be lost. Extended rain could cause sprouting." Lena read both lists. They look equally dangerous. They are not equal for us. Why? Because we still control the second one after the storm. Mara pointed toward the standing wheat. If it lodges, we can wait for the ground to firm. We can harvest slowly. We can separate damaged sections. Then she pointed toward the village sheds. If we cut wet grain, now we depend on machines and storage space we do not control. Lena understood. The choice was not only about crop condition, it was about capacity. The cooperative belonged to the whole village. Its dryer was already running without pause. Its workers were stretched thin. Even if Mara cut the lower field, she could not guarantee that the grain would be dried in time. Standing wheat carried weather risk. Cut wheat carried weather risk, storage risk, and transport risk at the same time. A truck stopped near the gate. Tomas stepped out. His clothes were streaked with dust, and his face looked older than it had that morning. "We have a machine free for 20 minutes, he said. "After that, it goes to the north farms." Mara did not answer immediately. Tomas looked across the field. "This is your final chance." "To do what?" "To get the crop down. It will not be safe once it is down. It will be safer than standing in 80-mile-an-hour wind." Where will you put it? We cleared another shed. With ventilation, we will move fans. From where the western storage floor, that grain is already wet. Tomas took off his cap. We are making adjustments as we go. You are moving the same drying capacity between larger piles. His jaw tightened. And you are preparing an explanation for why half your crop was left outside. Mara looked at the field. I do not need an explanation. I need a plan for what happens after cutting. The storm is the plan now. That is exactly the problem. Tomas stepped closer. You think waiting gives you control? No. Then what does it give you? One less transfer. He frowned. Mara explained. The wheat is still upright. It is separated by field. Air can still move between the plants. If I cut it, I have to move it, dry it, store it, and protect it before the storm. We do not have enough time for all four. Tomas looked toward the western ridge. The clouds had thickened into a dark wall. You may not have a crop left to move tomorrow. That may happen. Her willingness to admit it stopped him. He had expected defiance. Instead, Mara spoke like someone who had already accepted the cost. You are willing to lose it, he asked. I am willing to lose part of it rather than create a larger problem I cannot manage. Tomas looked toward Lena. Do you agree with this? Lena hesitated. 2 days earlier she would have said no. Now she looked at the notebook, at the moisture readings, and at the dark sheds near the cooperative. I think the lower field is still too wet. Tomas gave a tired laugh. So now the birds have convinced both of you. Mara closed the notebook. The birds led us to moving air. The grain made the decision. He looked at the empty sky above the lower field. No swallows crossed it. Most had already returned to the quarry. Tomas turned toward his truck. The machine leaves in 10 minutes. Mara nodded. We will not use it. He drove away without another word. Lena watched the truck disappear. Did we just refuse our last chance? We refused our last chance to cut before the storm. That sounds worse. It may feel worse tomorrow. Mara walked into the field. She marked the driest remaining strip near the eastern boundary, but she did not start the combine. There was no longer enough time to cut, transport, test, and store even that section safely. Instead, she prepared the farm for what could still be protected. She cleared debris from the drainage channels. She reinforced the doors of the grain shed. She moved the harvested ridge grain farther from the entrance. She checked the combine so it would be ready after the storm. Lena tied the uncut boundary near the neighboring field with bright cloth markers. If the wheat lodged, the markers would help identify where one farm ended and the next began. By late afternoon, the village machines began leaving the fields. Some farmers had finished. Others had cut more than they could move. Trailers waited along the road. Temporary grain piles filled the western shed. Tarps had been tied over loads that still tested too wet. Mara climbed the eastern ridge with Lena. From there, they could see the 2 decisions spread across the valley. Most fields had been cut. The village's harvest now depended on storage, fans, tarps, and a few remaining hours. Mara's lower field still stood. Its fate depended on stems, roots, drainage, and how hard the wind would strike. Neither side had escaped the storm. They had simply chosen where to meet it. Lena looked down at the wheat. Which loss do you think we chose? Mara watched the heads move beneath the first cold gust. The one that leaves us more choices afterward. A line of swallows crossed the eastern sky and disappeared into the quarry. Minutes later, the wind changed direction. The storm had reached the valley. The first gust reached Millstone Valley before the rain. It came from the west, cold enough to cut through the heat that had built all day. Dust lifted from the roads. Loose straw spun across the harvested fields. Tarps snapped against trailer frames. Then the wind dropped again. For several minutes the valley became still. That silence unsettled Mara more than the thunder. She stood at the barn entrance with Lena and watched the western sky turn almost black above the ridge. Across the village, farmers were still moving grain. The last trailers crawled toward the cooperative. Workers tied ropes over temporary piles. Tomas's crews rushed to move machinery under cover. The storm had not yet arrived, but the village had run out of time. A truck stopped near Mara's gate. 3 farmers climbed out. One was Tomas's cousin, Daniel Reed. The others owned fields near the river. Daniel pointed toward Mara's standing wheat. You left all of that out there, most of it. There is still time to cut the edge. No time to store it. We could lay it down and come back after the storm. Mara looked toward the lower field. That would put the heads closer to wet soil. Daniel shook his head. You would rather let the wind flatten it naturally. I would rather leave it attached to the roots. That will not save it from hail, no, or heavy rain, no. His frustration grew. Then why are you acting as if this is a plan? Because every option has a cost. Daniel glanced toward Lena, perhaps expecting her to look embarrassed. You know what people are saying, Mara did not ask. They say you followed birds into the hills while everyone else worked. I was checking airflow. They say you trust swallows more than the county forecast. The forecast is why I tested the field. Daniel gave a short laugh. You always have an explanation after the decision. Mara held his gaze. And you always want a simple answer before the evidence. One of the other farmers stepped between them. We did not come to argue. Tomas wants the eastern boundary cut. If your crop falls across the line, it may block our machine later. Mara had already considered that risk. She showed them the marked strip beside the fence. I left a clear boundary. If the wheat lodges, we can identify where each field begins. Daniel looked at the bright cloth markers. You prepared for failure. I prepared for wind. That is the same thing. No. Failure would be pretending the wind cannot change the field. Thunder broke over the western ridge. The men turned toward the sound. Daniel's anger disappeared for a moment. Fear replaced it. His own crop had been cut that morning and was still lying in thick rows near the river. He had not had enough trailers to move it all. Your field may be ruined by morning, he said. So may yours. The words were not cruel. That made them harder to hear. Daniel climbed back into the truck. Before leaving, he lowered the window. If you lose it, do not tell anyone the birds misled you. Mara answered calmly. The birds did not make the decision. The truck drove toward the village. Lena waited until it disappeared. Why does everyone keep saying that? Because following birds sounds foolish. You did follow them. Yes. Then are they wrong? They are wrong about why. Mara walked to the workbench and opened the notebook. She showed Lena the sequence of observations. Fewer swallows over the low fields, more birds feeding in the eastern airflow, rising humidity in the valley, falling pressure, slow drying in the test bundles, high moisture in the lower field grain, overloaded storage at the cooperative. The birds were the first sign, Mara said. They were not the conclusion. Lena looked toward the storm. But people remember the strange part. They remember what is easiest to mock. Rain began as scattered drops on the barn roof. Not enough to soak the ground. Enough to make everyone move faster. Tomas arrived in his truck. He did not get out. Mara walked to the driver's window. The cooperative has stopped accepting loads, he said. Why, Eli found 2 warm pockets in the western shed. He is spreading the grain and moving fans. How many trailers are still outside? 5, covered. For now, Tomas looked toward Mara's field. You still have time to regret this. I already regret that there was no good option. That is not what I mean. I know. He rested both hands on the steering wheel. People think you refused the plan because you wanted to prove me wrong. I wanted the crop tested by section. You challenged me in front of the whole village. I questioned the storage capacity. And now everyone will compare our results. Mara understood the deeper conflict. Tomas was not only afraid of losing grain, he was afraid that the storm would turn one decision into a judgment of his leadership. If your plan saves more grain, I will say so, Mara told him. And if yours does, then we learn from it. That sounds easy when you are not responsible for everyone. Mara looked toward the cooperative. I am responsible for my land, my grain, and my daughter. That is enough to make the decision difficult. Tomas's voice hardened. You chose to stand apart. No, I chose not to send wet grain into a full system. You could have helped the village instead of making people doubt. A village is not helped by hiding its limits. Lightning flashed behind the hills. Tomas raised the window halfway, then stopped. For your daughter's sake, I hope you are right. Mara stepped back. For everyone's sake, I hope the damage is smaller than we expect. He drove away. The rain strengthened. Mara and Lena secured the barn, checked the drainage channels, and moved tools from the floor. They had done everything they could for the grain already harvested. Nothing remained to do for the standing field. That helplessness was the hardest part. The wheat outside bent under the wind. Some heads struck one another. The sound moved across the field like dry water. Lena stood at the doorway. Are you afraid? Yes. You did not look afraid in front of Tomas. He did not need my fear. Do I? Mara looked at her daughter. You need the truth. She pointed toward the field. The crop may lodge. We may lose the lowest section. The hail may be worse than predicted. And the village. Their cut grain may survive under the tarps. The dryer may catch up. Their decision may still work. Lena looked surprised. You still think they could be right, they could have the better result. Then how can you be sure we should have waited? I am not sure of the result. Mara closed the notebook. I am sure we made the decision from the evidence we had, not from the pressure around us. The rain struck harder. Across the valley, floodlights glowed around the cooperative. Workers moved beneath them, trying to keep water away from trailers and temporary piles. In Mara's field, the wheat remained standing for the moment. The village had called her foolish because she refused to move with everyone else. But waiting had not been an act of faith. It had been a decision to keep one part of the harvest outside the overloaded chain of cutting, hauling, drying, and storage. Now the storm would test both choices, and by morning no explanation would matter as much as what remained. The storm did not arrive all at once. For nearly an hour rain fell lightly across Millstone Valley. It darkened the roads, softened the dust, and tapped against the roofs without causing immediate damage. Inside, the cooperative people began to relax. The tarps held. The trailers remained covered. The grain dryer continued running. Tomas stood beneath the loading roof and watched workers move wet grain from the western shed into thinner layers. Portable fans pushed air across the concrete floor. It may pass north of us, one farmer said. Another checked his phone. The worst part is still west. The radar showed the storm splitting around the hills. For the first time that evening, Tomas believed the village might have succeeded. They had cut early. Most of the grain was no longer standing in the fields. The cooperative was overcrowded, but the harvest was under roofs, tarps, or inside trailers. The plan had been rushed and imperfect. It also appeared to be working. At Mara's farm, Lena stood beside the barn door and watched the rain bead on the standing wheat. The wind is weaker, she said. For now. What if the storm misses us? Then the village may have made the better choice. Lena looked at her mother. And we will lose quality because we waited. Yes. Mara did not soften the answer. Her lower field was already beyond the ideal harvest stage. Another wet day could delay it further. The grain might lose value even if the storm caused no visible damage. Across the valley, headlights moved near the cooperative. The scene looked controlled. Lena saw it too. They got almost everything under cover. Almost. So Daniel was right. We do not know yet. But it looks like they beat the storm. Mara stepped into the rain and walked toward the test strip. The cut bundles had been left under a small, open-sided shelter. Even there, the air was damp enough that the stems had softened again. She lifted the bundle from the lower slope. It felt heavier than it had that afternoon. The crop had not needed direct rain to regain moisture. The surrounding air was enough. Mara split one head and pressed a kernel. It yielded easily. She brought the bundle back to the barn. Lena touched it. It is wetter. Yes, if that was in a trailer, it would still be wet. And if it was under a tarp, the tarp would stop rain. It would not remove the moisture already inside. Mara looked toward the village. The danger had never been only water falling from the sky. It was moisture trapped where air could no longer carry it away. At the cooperative, Eli moved from trailer to trailer with a temperature probe. The first load was stable. The second had warmed slightly. The third gave a reading that made him test it again. Tomas noticed. What is it? Too warm for this soon. It was covered before the rain. That is not the problem. Eli climbed onto the trailer and pulled back one corner of the tarp. Warm, damp air escaped from beneath it. The grain near the top looked clean. Deeper inside, the load was holding heat. Open it fully, Eli ordered. The rain will get in, the driver said. It is already heating. Tomas climbed onto the wheel. How serious, not dangerous yet. But it cannot stay sealed. They removed the tarp and positioned a fan beside the trailer. Rain blew across the exposed surface. Tomas looked at the other covered loads. How many more could be like this, all the wet ones? The apparent victory began to change shape. The village had protected the grain from direct rain by covering it tightly. But the same covers also limited ventilation. The loads harvested from the lower fields had entered the trailers warm and moist. Now that heat had nowhere to escape. Eli moved to the western shed. The grain spread across the floor was no longer heating as quickly, but there was too much of it for the available fans. The outer layers cooled. The deeper sections remained warm. We need to turn it again, he said. With whom, Tomas asked. Anyone who is not already moving trailers. Most workers had been awake since before sunrise. Several had returned home to protect their own buildings. Tomas looked around the yard. Every solution required labor space or airflow they no longer had. A farmer ran in from the road. One tarp tore loose near the river. How much grain? 2 full trailers. Tomas swore and called for another crew. The light rain intensified. For a few minutes, everyone continued believing the worst had passed. Then the birds left the cooperative roof. Dozens of swallows had been sheltering beneath the eaves. They rose together, circled once, and flew east, toward the quarry. Eli watched them disappear. The air changed seconds later. A cold gust struck the yard and lifted grain dust from the concrete. One of the open tarps snapped violently against its ropes. The western sky flashed white. Thunder followed almost immediately. Tomas looked toward the hills. The dark line they had mistaken for the storm's northern edge was moving directly into the valley. At Mara's farm, the red cloth tied to the eastern fence pulled tight. Then it twisted toward the west. Mara closed the barn doors. Lena stood beside her. They did not beat it. No. What happens now? Mara looked toward the cooperative lights. The village has grain in fields, trailers, sheds, and temporary piles. And ours, most of ours, is still attached to the ground. Lightning spread across the entire western sky. The first hard drops struck the roof like thrown stones. For several hours the village had believed cutting early had placed the harvest beyond the storm. Now the real storm had arrived, and much of the grain was no longer protected by roots, standing stems, or open air. It was trapped inside a system that had already reached its limit. The storm crossed the western ridge with violent speed. Rain struck the valley sideways. Wind drove it beneath tarps, through shed openings, and across every field still holding exposed grain. At the cooperative, workers abandoned the idea of keeping everything dry. Their only goal was to prevent greater damage. Tomas ordered the covered trailers moved beneath the loading roof, but there was not enough space for all of them. 2 remained outside. One tarp tore completely loose and disappeared into the darkness. Eli climbed onto the nearest trailer with a flashlight. Water was collecting along the edges. "Open the drain gaps," he shouted. "If we open them, more rain gets in," the driver answered. "It is already getting in. Do not let it pool." Inside the western shed, the grain spread across the floor was protected from direct rain, but the air had become warm and heavy. Fans ran continuously, pushing humid air through a crop that had entered the building too wet. The system could no longer remove moisture efficiently. It was only slowing the damage. Across the valley, the cut wheat left in windrows suffered first. Rain flattened the rows against the soil. Water gathered beneath them where the straw formed a dense barrier that trapped moisture close to the ground. In the fields near the river, runoff moved through the lowest sections and carried loose heads into the drainage channels. The grain had been cut to escape the storm. Now it lay directly in its path. At the Ward farm, Mara and Lena watched from inside the barn. The standing wheat, bent under each gust, rose slightly, then bent again. The lower field moved in waves. For several minutes the stems held. Then a section near the willow trees began to fold. Lena gripped the barn door. "It is going down." Mara saw it. The ground there was softer, and the plants had grown taller. Their heavy heads pulled the stems toward the soil as the wind pressed from the west. A broad patch lodged within minutes. Mara did not look away. "That section may be difficult to save. What about the rest? We wait until morning." A sharp burst of hail struck the roof. Lena flinched. The stones were small, but they hit hard enough to strip leaves from the hedge. Mara moved farther inside and closed the door to a narrow gap. They could no longer see the field clearly. Only the sound remained. Rain. Wind. The repeated impact of hail against metal. For weeks the harvest had been measured in moisture percentages, drying hours, and machine capacity. Now none of those numbers could change what was happening outside. Mara had chosen to leave most of the crop standing because she believed it preserved more options. The storm was testing that choice at its weakest point. If the wind lasted long enough, the whole field could lodge. If the hail intensified, the grain heads could shatter before harvest. If the rain continued for days, kernels might begin to sprout in the heads. Waiting had not removed the danger. It had only kept the crop in a different form. Lena sat on an overturned bucket. "Do you still think we made the right decision?" Mara remained near the door. "I think we made the best decision we could with the information we had. That is not what I asked." "No." Mara looked at her daughter. "I do not know yet." The storm continued for nearly 2 hours. At the cooperative, Eli found water entering beneath the southern door. Workers built a barrier from empty feed sacks and pushed grain away from the wall. Tomas moved between the trailers and sheds, trying to decide which problem required attention first. One trailer was taking on rain. Another was heating under a loosened cover. The dryer had shut down briefly after water entered an electrical connection. The village had harvested early to gain control. Now the crop was divided across too many places to protect at once. Shortly after midnight, the wind weakened. Rain continued, but it fell vertically now. Mara opened the barn door. The field appeared silver under the yard light. The section near the willows was flat. Another strip along the western edge leaned heavily, but the middle of the field remained standing. The heads were wet and bowed, yet most had not touched the soil. Lena stepped beside her. It survived. Part of it did. That is more than I expected. It is too early to call it safe. Mara pointed toward the lodge section. If water remains there, the grain could deteriorate quickly. She then looked toward the standing center. That crop still needs dry weather. Nothing had been won, but the field had preserved a distinction the village's early harvest had erased. Mara's wheat was still separated by slope and condition. The ridge had already been harvested and stored. The middle field remained standing. The lowest section had lodged and could be handled separately. At the cooperative, dry grain, damp grain, and wet grain had been mixed across trailers, floors, and temporary piles under emergency pressure. Morning revealed the full damage. Cut windrows near the river were dark and pressed into the soil. Several trailers contained wet surface layers over warmer grain beneath. One section of the western shed had begun to smell sour. Eli ordered it turned immediately. Tomas stood outside the loading roof, soaked and silent. From there he could see Mara's farm across the valley. Much of her wheat was still upright. Not untouched, not perfect, but still above the mud. He arrived at the ward gate just after sunrise. Mara was already walking the field. Tomas followed her to the lodge section. "You lost some," he said. "Yes, how much I will know after the ground drains." He looked toward the standing middle field. "And that's still harvestable if the weather clears." Tomas looked back toward the village. "We cut to protect the grain." "I know. We thought getting it off the stalk meant getting it out of danger." Mara lifted a wet head from the lodged wheat. "The danger changed when you cut it." Tomas nodded slowly. Behind him, swallows returned from the quarry. They crossed the eastern ridge but did not descend over the flooded lower fields. Mara watched them briefly, then returned her attention to the crop. The birds had not saved her harvest. They had only led her to notice that the valley's air moisture and drying conditions were changing before the village acted as if they were not. The storm had done the rest. It had not proven that waiting was safe. It had proven that harvesting early was not the same as escaping the weather. By midday the rain had stopped. Water still filled the ditches and the lower fields near the river were too soft for machinery. Across the village, farmers began uncovering trailers, opening grain piles, and spreading wet wheat into thinner layers. The damage was uneven. Some early loads had stayed dry enough to save. Others had absorbed water or heated beneath tarps. At the cooperative, Eli separated the grain into 3 groups. Dry enough to store, wet but recoverable, too damaged to mix with the rest. Tomas helped without giving orders. For the first time since the warning, he was no longer trying to move the whole village in one direction. Each load now had to be judged separately. On Mara's farm, the result was clearer. The ridge grain was already safe in storage. Most of the middle field still stood, though. Several areas leaned heavily. The lowest section near the willows had lodged against the wet soil. Lena looked over the field. "How much did we lose?" "We will not know until we harvest it." "But the standing part is still good, it may be." Mara broke open several heads. The kernels were wet on the surface but still firm. They had not begun sprouting and most remained clean. She marked the lodge section with red flags. "That part stays separate." "Why it touched the soil. It will dry differently and may carry mud or damaged grain." Mara then marked the standing center with blue flags. "This section waits until the ground is firm." Lena looked toward the village fields. Many of the cut windrows were still pressed into wet soil, so they have to dry everything again. "Yes, and some of it was already too wet before the storm." "Yes, the village had not lost the whole harvest. But early cutting had created extra work. The grain had to be turned, dried, retested, and separated. Every additional step cost time and labor. Mara's crop still required patience, but much of it remained where it had grown. 2 days later, dry northern wind entered the valley. The standing wheat began to release moisture. The heads lifted slightly as the stems dried. Mara waited until the soil could support the combine. Then she began with the middle field. She moved slowly and kept the grain separate from the lodge section. Lena tested each load before it left the field. The quality was not perfect. The wheat had matured further than Mara preferred, and a small amount had been lost to wind. but the grain was cleaner and more uniform than much of what had been cut before the storm. Eli tested the first trailer at the cooperative. "This can go into the ventilated bin," he said. "No emergency drying?" Lena asked. "Not for this load." Tomas stood nearby. He looked at the moisture reading, then toward Mara. "You waited for the grain, not the storm." Mara nodded. The storm was only one part of the decision. He glanced toward the temporary sheds where workers were still turning damp grain. "We counted the hours until the rain. You needed to count the hours until the crop was safe." Tomas accepted the answer without argument. By the end of the week, Mara had harvested most of the standing wheat. The lodged section produced less and had to be sold at a lower grade. She had not escaped damage. She had simply kept the damaged portion separate from the stronger crop. That was the difference her decision had preserved. The village had treated the harvest as one emergency. Mara had treated it as several smaller risks. And after the storm, smaller risks were easier to manage. 3 clear days followed the storm. Mara did not rush. She began with the standing wheat on the upper slope, where the wind had dried the heads first. The middle field came next. The lodge section near the willows remained untouched until the ground hardened. This time, the harvest followed the condition of the land, not the boundaries of the field, not the pressure of the village. Each load was kept separate and tested before storage. The upper grain was dry and clean. The middle field showed slightly lower quality but remained usable. The lodged wheat produced less. Some heads had touched the mud, and part of the crop had begun to discolor. Mara accepted the loss and kept it away from the stronger grain. Lena recorded every result. "How much did we save?" she asked. "Enough. To pay the loan, yes. And keep the eastern field." Mara nodded. They had not escaped the storm without damage. They had lost part of the lowest crop and missed the highest market grade on some loads. But the farm remained stable. At the cooperative, the village was still dealing with the early harvest. Fans ran day and night. Several wet loads had to be sold cheaply for feed. Other grain was saved only after repeated drying and turning. Tomas stood beside Eli as Mara's final clean load was tested. The moisture readings settled within the safe range. Eli wrote the result on the delivery sheet. "No emergency drying," he said. Tomas looked at the grain in the trailer. "You harvested later and brought in drier wheat." "From the sections that remained standing," Mara said. He glanced toward the temporary sheds. "We thought the storm was the deadline." "It was one deadline." "What was the other?" "The point when the grain could be stored without creating another emergency." Tomas nodded slowly. He had spent the week making difficult choices, which loads to dry first, which grain to separate, and which damaged batches could no longer be saved. His early plan had protected part of the village harvest. It had also overwhelmed the system meant to handle it. "I was wrong to call waiting foolish," he said. Mara did not answer immediately. "You were trying to protect the village. That does not make every decision correct." "No." He looked toward Lena, who was writing the moisture reading in the notebook. "Was it really the birds?" Lena looked at her mother. Mara answered. "They were the first sign of the storm of the air changing." She explained that the swallows had followed the insects into the eastern airflow. Their movement showed that the lower valley had become still and humid before the shift was obvious to the people working there. That observation led Mara to test the crop more carefully. The grain moisture, drying rate, storage capacity, and field position had shaped the final decision. "So the birds did not tell you to wait," Tomas said. "No. They told you where to look." "Yes." Several farmers nearby had been listening. Daniel Reed stepped forward. "My river field was already too wet when we cut it." Mara nodded. "It may have needed more time. We would still have risked lodging." "Yes." Daniel looked surprised by her agreement. Mara had never claimed waiting was safe for every field. The western farms, which had matured earlier, had benefited from harvesting before the storm. Some of their grain had reached storage in good condition. The lowest, greenest fields had created most of the trouble. The mistake was not early harvesting itself. The mistake was applying one decision to the entire valley. Tomas turned toward the village map hanging on the cooperative wall. "We should mark the fast-drying fields. And the sheltered ones," Mara said. "The low ground too," Eli added. Lena opened the notebook. "And the places where the swallows usually feed." Daniel smiled. "Are birds part of the official harvest plan now?" "Not as a forecast," Mara said. "As an observation." Tomas took a pencil and divided the village map into smaller zones. High ridges, river ground, sheltered basins, eastern airflow. For the first time, the map described how the valley behaved instead of showing only who owned each field. The storm had not proved that Mara possessed better instincts than everyone else. It had proved that the village contained several harvest windows, even when one forecast covered them all. The next season, the farmers would still listen to the county warning. They would still watch the radar. But before lowering every machine at once, they would also walk the fields. They would test the grain, they would measure their storage capacity, and they would look at the sky above the lower valley to see whether the birds were still feeding there. The second harvest did more than save Mara's wheat. It changed the questions the village asked before the next storm. By the end of the season, Millstone Valley had returned to its usual rhythm. The damaged grain had been sold, dried, or separated. The temporary sheds were empty again. The cooperative record showed clearly which fields had produced the most trouble. The wettest loads had come from the lowest, most sheltered ground. The safest early harvests had come from the exposed ridges. Mara's decision had not been correct for every field. It had been correct for hers. That distinction became the most important lesson of the storm. One morning, Lena carried the old notebook to the eastern ridge. The swallows had returned to their usual pattern. They crossed the valley in wide arcs, feeding above the wheat stubble and the hedges. "They are back over the lower fields," Lena said. "The insects are back too," Mara replied. "So the air is moving normally again." Mara nodded. Lena opened the notebook. She had created a new page with 6 headings: bird movement, ground wind, humidity, grain moisture, field position, storage capacity. Mara, read the list. "You added the cooperative. The field does not end when the grain enters the machine." That was the lesson Thomas and the village had learned too late. A crop was not safe simply because it had been cut. It still had to be moved, dried, stored, and protected. Ignoring those steps had turned one weather risk into several. Thomas joined them on the ridge, carrying a folded map. He had divided the village into smaller harvest zones. The high western farms were marked as early drying ground. The river fields were marked as high moisture areas. The eastern gap was labeled as a wind corridor. The sheltered basins were marked for separate testing. "This is not a schedule," he said. "It is only a guide." "That is better," Mara replied. "Why? Because the land changes. A wet spring could delay one field. A dry summer could harden another. A damaged drainage channel could change how long water remained in the soil. No map forecast or animal behavior could replace walking the ground." Tomas looked toward the swallows. "People will still say, 'You followed the birds.' I did. And you do not mind." "No." He waited. Mara continued. "I followed them because they had changed direction. Then I checked why. The birds had led her toward moving air. The moving air had revealed how differently the valley was behaving from one slope to another. The grain samples had shown which parts were ready. The overloaded cooperative had shown which risks the village could no longer manage. The decision had come from all of it together, not from one sign, not from instinct alone, not from the birds. Lena wrote a final sentence beneath the storm record. "A sign is not an answer. It is a reason to look closer." Mara read it and smiled. Below them, farmers were repairing drainage channels and cleaning machinery for the next season. No one abandoned weather forecasts. No one stopped using the cooperative dryer. The village simply stopped treating one warning as one instruction for every field. The next time a storm approached, Tomas planned to test the ridges first, the river ground separately, and the sheltered basins last. Eli would calculate storage capacity before the first machine entered the wheat, and Lena would record whether the swallows were feeding across the valley or gathering near shelter. Not because the birds could predict the future, because their movement could reveal that the present had already begun to change. Mara looked across the fields. The storm had damaged her lowest crop. It had delayed the harvest and reduced part of its value, but it had left her with enough clean grain to keep the farm. More importantly, it had changed the way the village understood risk. The others had watched the sky and hurried to escape the storm. Mara had watched the birds and discovered that the valley's air had changed before the rain arrived. The birds had not told her to wait. They had shown her where to begin asking the right questions.